Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to Faith and Science Responses to Storms, Wildfires, and Climate Change webinar. I'm Paz Artaza Regan, Program Manager at Catholic Climate Covenant. Before we get started, we always try to start with a prayer. So please indulge us here for a couple of seconds. For today's webinar, I have chosen a prayer for rescue, recovery, and relief workers. I would also like to, because today is a very special day as well as All Souls Day, to remember all of those who have died because of the disasters all around the world this year. Let us center ourselves and remember that God is always in our presence. God, our help and hope when waters rise. You brought Israel safely through the sea. Sustain all those who seek to save others, so that they may repair the ruined cities, raise up the former devastations, and be the restorers of streets to live in. Through Jesus Christ, our eternal Savior. At this point, we have a little bit of information to distribute to you all. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent out in next month's newsletter. We will also attempt to send it out in email all by itself if our technology works. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation. We ask that you submit your questions by writing them in the chat box on the left lower side of your screen. You may need to scroll down to see that box. Please note that the questions and comments are only seen by presenters. If you have audio issues, it's most likely due to Wi-Fi connectivity issues. You can try connecting via phone for the audio. We have an information-packed hour where we will listen to a climate scientist explain how climate change affects storms and wildfires, local experts in disaster response and relief outlining how weather-related disasters are already impacting our communities, and especially our most vulnerable brothers and sisters, and how the church is responding. Let us introduce you to the three speakers today. Dr. Alan Betts is a leading climate researcher and a frequent speaker across Vermont to many citizen, professional, and church groups. He'll be explaining the impacts of climate issues today. Alan is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, and the Royal Meteorological Society, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a past vice president of the Vermont Academy of Science and Engineering. Besides being in Vermont and having had no power this week due to the storm that hit this past weekend, Alan has a daughter who had to be evacuated from the U.S. Virgin Islands to Puerto Rico because of Irma, and then from Puerto Rico to the U.S. because of Maria. So he comes with a lot of personal information on this. Next, we'll hear from Natalie Wood, who's Senior Vice President of Programs for Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston. As you know, Catholic Charities provides comprehensive network of social services that empower people to grow and thrive. Natalie is a licensed professional counselor with a master's degree in clinical psychology and has worked with Catholic Charities for more than 20 years. At the end, Elizabeth Disco-Shearer is the CEO of Disaster Services for the Society of St. Vincent de Paul of the United States. She oversees the disaster recovery efforts of 8 regions of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. Currently, she is managing the disaster relief for St. Vincent de Paul and recovery efforts for Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, in addition to 31 other disasters across the nation. We are honored to have such knowledgeable presenters with us today. Dr. Alan Betts will get us started. Alan?
I'm ready. Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. I have to get myself a little organized. Okay, I'm going to talk today about the relationship between our changing climate, a little bit about what's driving that so we can understand it better, and what it has meant for us in terms of hurricanes and extreme weather. Let's start with some of the fundamentals of climate change. As you all know, the burning of the fossil fuels is transforming our climate. And it's not just the fossil fuels which are putting more carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, in the atmosphere. That sets in line a whole chain of processes, mostly related to water, that are accelerating climate change. And in a very broad sense, we're heading back to a high CO2 climate, back of the days of the Carboniferous era, when all the fossil fuels were taken from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the Earth is warming, and one consequence of this is that a lot of heat is being stored in the oceans, and that, of course, affects hurricanes. I'll come back to that. And at the same time, extremes of climate are also increasing. Now, in a broad sense, this is just linked to the fact that we have not managed our technology, we have not managed our waste streams. And it's a problem that's soluble by changing the system guidelines by which we run our society, essentially create an efficient society, an efficient energy society based on renewable energy. You all know that there's been an avoidance of responsibility for decades by all of us, politicians and the public. And the fundamental issue for this, which we won't have much time to discuss, is that climate change is just incompatible with our economic and business as usual strategy. What we face is the issue that we need to make choices based on different things, specifically moral values. We have to guide science and economics. And I will come back to that later. The present challenge, if I sum it up in one slide, is that we have to integrate all we know, all we understand, all that we value, given the deep interconnectedness of life and climate on Earth, and in the face of immense opposition to change. My slides are not moving smoothly, so I'll have to wait for them more. Excuse me. There's a lag in this system. Okay. Here's a picture of the Earth, and around it you can see the very thin blue line of the atmosphere of the Earth. The burning of the fossil fuels is increasing, greenhouse gases, and that it reduces the amount the Earth can cool to space. So the climate warms, the oceans warm, evaporation goes up, water vapor goes up, and the rise of water vapor from evaporation roughly triples the effect of CO2. Ice melts, and because ice reflects sunlight, that increases the warming, and extreme weather is increasing because the weather patterns on the planet are actually changing as well. This graph just shows global temperatures, and with a smooth red line averaging over many years. And if you just look at the end to the right, you'll see the very steep rise that's occurred in the last few years, 2014, 15, and the last point is 2016. As the climate warms, we're losing the Arctic ice sheets. And this shows the map on the right of looking down on the North Pole of the minimum of sea ice in mid-September 2012 when it was lowest. What you're seeing here is as that ice melts, less sunlight is reflected, so the Arctic is warming. More water evaporates because there's more open water, and that produces a strong warming because of the water vapor, which is a greenhouse gas. And the other thing I'd like to explain is that what's happening here in the Arctic, which is warming twice as fast as the Earth, is the same feedbacks that happen in northern winters. If we have less snow, less reflection of sunlight, more evaporation of water from a wet surface, means that the winters are the same feedbacks here between ice and evaporation happen with our winters. And if we have winters with less snow, they are much warmer. This graph looks complicated, but it was produced just last year to show the link between things that we do, in this case driving cars, and the size of the Arctic sea ice, how much is lost in September. And the bottom axis is the total of all the emissions of CO2 back to 1850, and the left axis is the September sea ice cover. And it varies from year to year, but a line has been drawn on from the 50s to recent years, which shows the slope of that link. This is only the period we've had good data on the sea ice. And it amounts to, if you translate it in terms of the emissions of a car, if you drive a 12,000 miles a year, that makes 25 miles per gallon, you're responsible for melting 150 square feet of the Arctic sea ice in the September. Because the Earth can't cool to space, the Earth is warming, and 90% of that heat is being stored in the ocean. The graph you're seeing there, which is has lots of fluctuations back in the 1960s and 70s, has become very sharp because about 15 years ago, we put 5,000 floats that go up and down to 6,000 feet in the ocean, measuring very precisely the temperature of the ocean. So we now know exactly how much of the the imbalance of heat of the Earth is being stored in the ocean. And the green curve underneath is just the rise of CO2 during that period. As Paz mentioned, the last month I've practically been a hurricane forecaster because my daughter and her family has lived on St. Thomas for the last 7 years. And this is the radar from Puerto Rico, just as the northern eye wall grazed the north shore of St. Thomas. Irma was the most powerful hurricane to develop in the Atlantic. The winds were up to 180 miles per hour. And at this moment, where all those red crosses are, my daughter's family is sheltering in a hotel room on the ground floor on the east end with hurricane shutters. The water's coming through the walls and under the floor and everywhere, and they're terrified. But they survived. On 9/11, they were evacuated to Puerto Rico. Here's just a picture of the kind of damage a Category 5 hurricane simply blows out the walls of buildings and blows the contents out onto the street. They were evacuated on 9/11, and about 5 days later, Maria developed to a Category 5 storm in just 24 hours. Hit Puerto Rico, went across on the track you can see here. Not as strong as Irma was, but still a devastating storm, which knocked out most of the power for Puerto Rico, and people have been struggling there for more than a month now, with many without running water, drinkable water, most without power, and many without communications because I think 1,000 of the cell phone towers were destroyed. Why was Harvey so devastating? I mean, this gives you a kind of glimpse into one other aspect as well. First of all, it came off the Gulf of Mexico, a warm ocean, huge evaporation with the strong winds. Very strong storm developed. Very heavy rainfall because of the high evaporation and the strong storm, something like 12 inches a day. And then something unusual happened. Instead of it going inland quickly, there were two stationary patterns of high pressure to the north that trapped it for 4 days over Houston. So the result was 4 feet of rain and massive, massive flooding. Now, one of those stationary high patterns was over to the northwest of the United States, which was responsible for the very high temperatures that gave flooding. We'll come back to that. To shift topics, I just wanted to give you a glimpse into winter. Here I am gardening, digging over in January, and this is what woke me up to what is happening to our winters. And I'll just scan through these pictures. This was 10 years ago, and there have been many occasions since when I've been able to dig in winter. And for the very first time in 2016, which was exceptionally warm, here's my granddaughter, who's only 7 years old, digging for perhaps the first time in Vermont for 100,000 years. The winter of last winter was so warm that now I'm starting to garden through the winter. This is a spinach and a lettuce crop. Winters are now cold. How cold our winters are essentially related to how much snow cover there is. This is a graph for Alberta in Canada, and simply the fraction of days of snow cover is related to the mean temperature of the cold season. Like the Arctic ice, we track in Vermont a reference lake, and the graph on the left shows the date on which it freezes in days of the year, which is getting later every year on average, and the date with which it melts in the spring. And on the right, the days that it is frozen, which has been shrinking by 7 days every decade. And if you just look on the right, though, and look at the last few years, the change between 2015 and 2016 has been huge. And the reason is another stationary pattern issue. This one shows you 2015, January, February, March, and 2016, January, February, March. The dark brown colors and red colors are the very high temperatures in the northern continents. But if you look at 2015, there's a blue cold patch over eastern Canada and the eastern United States. What was unusual is that the pattern for January, February, March stayed the same for those 3 months in both years. These stationary patterns are driving extreme weather. Heavy precipitation is also increasing, and this just shows how much heavy rain days have increased in the northeast United States. We had a tropical storm come by 6 years ago, producing tremendous devastation and cutting off 20 towns. But if you step back and look at the United States as a whole, for the 6 months from March to August, on the left, those number ones in a dark red mean that for the whole record, which goes back to 1895, Texas and New Mexico had record drought, when the 117s mean that Ohio to Vermont had the wettest 6 months on record. So although within this we had, in fact, 2 severe floods, the patterns of where the storms traveled and dumped rain for that entire 6-month period essentially did not change. Drought in Texas, flooding in the Northeast. And we had this this is a picture of the floodplain. I walk down to a bridge you cannot see every morning, but not on this day. The water is 10 feet deep. This shows you on the left a similar graph without figures on it of the dark red cover on the left for the summer of 2017. The parts of the United States that had record temperatures for that summer. And you can see it was all across the western United States. The summer of this year, record temperatures. And in the Northeast, we even had Montana with the driest 3 months on record and dry, low precipitation drought across the Northeast. And this is what led to the widespread fires. It had been a wet winter in the West, a lot of growth, then followed by a record temperatures and very low amounts of precipitation. And these kind of pictures are quite common, and this is the one for my home state of Vermont, just how much the climate will change this century if we stay on a fossil fuel economy, business as usual. The climate of Vermont from the last century will be more like the climate of Georgia was, northwest Georgia during the last century. And just imagine for a moment what that means for our ecosystems and for the forests of our states in the Northeast. Can we stop dangerous climate change? The answer is yes. We made this promise with the Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, 25 years ago. But it's very difficult for us because it means an 80% drop in our burning of fossil fuels that have driven our industrial growth for 200 years. And of course, there are powerful interests at stake because the fossil fuels are worth tens of trillions of dollars. There is one piece of good news. This graph shows you the total emissions from the globe back to 1990, which rose slowly through the 90s and 2000s, very steeply through the 2000s, as a lot of our industrial production was moved to China, and the power supply was fossil fuel, coal-fired power plants. That polluted the Chinese cities, And China has shifted massively to renewable energy and shutting down coal-fired power plants just in the last 5 years. And we have stabilized the emissions of CO2. And you might think, wonderful, but unfortunately, it's about 5 times as much. And if you just look up in the graph in the top right corner, that is the steady rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The present levels of emissions are way too high. CO2 will go on rising until we drop emissions. And we really need to go down 5% per year until 2050. As you probably all know, 2015 was a transition year. We had the climate meeting in Paris and 188 nations made commitments. And the Pope Francis encyclical on the environment and climate change and our responsibilities to the earth was a major player in shifting attitudes around the earth. He said that exploitation of the earth and the poor are now inseparable, and short-term profit as the primary motive for our society is immoral. Now, you also know that the US is trying to back out of that agreement, leaving China and Europe to take the lead. What we need is new guidelines for society, and this is just a summary of the issues. We have to re-educate our society because the transition we face is huge. We have to develop renewable energy and maximize energy efficiency. We have to look at all our waste streams and remanufacture, recycle everything, and fully cost our waste streams, including CO2. Relocalize our food supply, compost all organic waste, and much more fundamentally reconnect with the natural world. It's fundamental if we're going to embrace the transition, and for most of us, this means asking for spiritual guidance. The future is not our past, which is a system based where everything has been driven by short-term profit. We make things, if we can make a profit, we sell them. Collectively, we are responsible for the future. We create the future. We have to plan for the transition to a sustainable society and put community values and faith values above profit. And we have to remember that the creation, which is storing all the energy from the fossil fuels and the greenhouse gases of the past, will overwhelm human folly. So my advice is accept, repent, and do it with joy. And I'll close with this quotation that I'm sure you're familiar with from the encyclical of 2015. Many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. We lack an awareness of our common origin, our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone.
Great. Thank you, Alan. At this point, I will ask Natalie if she would please join us and give us her presentation. Hello, Natalie?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, and unfortunately, we've lost the slides, so let me bring them back up. There we go. Do you see them, Natalie?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Okay, I can't, unfortunately, it looks like I can't get my picture on the screen, but that's okay.
Yes, that's fine. But for some reason, the slides keep coming in and out. Hold on, let me try again. There they are. Natalie, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, and your slides are there.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm here to tell you a little bit about our experience with Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey was probably the most devastating hurricane that we've had in Texas in a very long time. And we're still in the midst of attempting to get through the relief part and get on with long-term disaster. So to let you know a little bit about our agency, we're a large agency. We've been here for about 75 years. We serve an unduplicated count of about 82,000 people annually. Our complete goal of all our programs is to increase self-sufficiency. We have been, recognized by the Better Business Bureau. We're accredited. We're affiliated with the United Way. We've had a very small disaster response team. We've carried disaster contracts for the state. We've got 9 different locations, and there's about 6.6 million people in Houston. So we're a large organization, and we have been overwhelmed with the amount of requests for assistance. So if you look at the history of what we have experienced, 2001, we went through Tropical Storm Allison, which was a tropical storm that kind of did the same thing. It got stuck and it flooded very badly in certain areas. Then in 2005, there was Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita that hit the Gulf Coast. And then in 2008, there was Hurricane Ike. And then suddenly, we began to have flooding. So although it's not identified on the slide, they were not declared natural disasters by FEMA, we began to have flooding when it would rain. Then in 2015, we had the Tax Day floods, which happened on Tax Day. And then we had the Memorial Day floods. And then again in 2016, it happened again, but this time it was much more severe. And then in 2017, we had Hurricane Harvey. And we were still working with a lot of the people from 2016 and 2015 when we got hit. So we were totally unprepared, as much proactively as we planned. And we've got residential centers, and we came up with plans A, B, and C with what was going to happen. And we our normal operation is to wait until things calm down a little bit and then to begin to do long-term case management, because that's what we specialize in, what we've done. We've been leaders in the community with the case management. But this time it was just too much damage. There are more than 35,000 people who are forced out of their homes. At one point, one of our shelters here in Houston had more than 10,000 people. We've got more than 200,000 homes that have been reported as damaged or destroyed. We had 122,300 rescues performed, and this is by official rescue people. What happened in Houston was that there were so many people who were flooded, and it was happening so quickly that people just started getting in their boats or pulling their cars over, and they just started helping people. And so literally you could see that everyone was just doing everything that they could to help. And so finally, one of the, I think it was the mayor, went on television and he told everyone to please help, because there was no way that our emergency services could keep up or be able to save all of those people. As of this morning, I was told that there's been 810 applications for FEMA, and that's equally split between renters and homeowners. So the governor is saying that there's probably going to be about $180 billion in financial damage, but we're still in the middle of it, because even though this occurred so long ago in September and the beginnings of October, because of the fact that the hurricane stalled like it did over us and progressed over time, the flooding occurred. People are at different places. So you have some people who weren't flooded until the very end of the flooding cycle, and others who by then had already been flooded and began mucking and gutting. So a lot of difference. So we went, the hurricane hit that Friday. By the following Wednesday, there was still flooding going on in the city as the rivers and our levees filled up and our bayous were overflowing. But we went ahead and opened on Thursday because we could get to our offices. And we had people lining up for help. So within about 3 weeks, we served about 15,000 people, and we handed out more than $176,000 in gift cards. We set up a distribution center where people could get food and water and clothing and cleaning supplies to be able to maintain their home. And because people were in so many different places, this meant that we were in a real scramble to try and get all of the different services together. So the priority kind of was, the majority of people who came in were really just looking for the basics because they'd lost everything. And so we were struggling to find places for them to go because there were so many who had nowhere to go. One of the largest challenges we had in Houston prior to the storm was affordable housing. So now, as you can imagine, it's even harder. So we're having trouble at the front end with finding temporary housing because there's only so much temporary housing available. And then trying to restabilize people and move them into affordable housing is also really hard. Transportation has been another issue because about 30,000 cars were flooded. And so people are coming to us because they need the assistance. FEMA is something that for most of these people, because what was really unique to Harvey is that it was an equal opportunity destroyer, and it just went across the board. So you have high income and low income people who were devastated by the flooding. And so you had some people who had no idea how to navigate any type of social services at all, and other people who didn't know how to navigate because they were new to our country. So we had to spend a lot of time educating on disasters and FEMA and how slow that process really works. We've had to work really hard to staff up because obviously if you've got this many people coming to you for assistance, because now at this point we have about 19,000 that we've worked with. So we have not been able to staff up fast enough because we need people and they need to be bilingual people because we do have many refugees in this country and many immigrants. So there's a lot of different languages being spoken. The political climate right now makes the undocumented very frightened to come out. They have they stay in their apartments or their houses. And so we find out about them. We had one entire apartment complex that we gave checks to another church to be able to cover the rent because they were going to actually evict all of their immigrants because their immigrants weren't able to pay their rent because they weren't able to work during the times that it was flooded. And so we assisted that apartment complex so that something like 200 individuals were going to be evicted there. We had another person call us from another place saying that they were all undocumented there in that apartment complex and they were terrified to come out. And so they asked us what we could do to help. So fortunately for us, CCUSA was here and they had their large mobile truck or mobile unit, and we were able to just fully stock it with supplies and go out there. And when we went out there and they saw the truck and they saw our vans, they started coming out and they were very glad to see us. And they had not come out of their homes since Harvey. And this was only just about a week ago. So that was very sad. And then being able to communicate, because there's so many different languages, trying to communicate with everyone in a language that they can understand, and then also trying to keep all of our locations kind of on the same page because everyone was overwhelmed with the volume of requests we were receiving, and the hours were very long. So we made a collaboration with our Archdiocese and St. Vincent de Paul so that we could work together. And so that included the Knights of Columbus and a couple of advocacy groups. We've also hired temps because you just can't hire people fast enough. And we prioritized who it was that we were going to work with. So our priority is the most vulnerable. which is seniors, the disabled, the immigrants, refugees, large families, single women with children, and the undocumented. We also have members that sit on the VOAD. We have the VOAD chair. We have people who are on the co-chairs for some of the United Way long-term groups, so that we are able to keep up with the information, because there's so many people involved in trying to figure out what's going on. You have to be constantly involved in meetings, which takes up a lot of time. But what we've discovered is, due to the number of floods that we've had and the frequency with which they've been occurring, we are not going to be able to. Normally, we shrink our disaster recovery program down to the director and probably one assistant, but there's no way we're going to be able to do that going forward. We are going to have to build a very robust disaster recovery program, and then also keep quite a few of them on board for responding. And then we have to really deepen our infrastructure to be able to handle all of that we've got going on. So our number one agenda is hope, and that's what we're working hard to provide to both our staff, who are also affected, and the city. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Natalie. And I hope everybody is starting to get a picture of what it's like during one of these weather-related disasters. At this point, we're going to switch over to Liz. And Liz, you're going to be talking to us about the impacts of Maria on Puerto Rico. And perhaps you might want to also add a little bit of your experience with the wildfires, since you were there as of yesterday.
Yes. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually here in California, visiting several of our impacted dioceses from the wildfires. We unfortunately lost one of our founding members of St. Vincent de Paul with the Diocese of Sonoma. His wife and him, they were trying to evacuate, and they found them in their garage in their car. We have two other Vincentians that lost their homes. I'm in Napa today in the wine country, and this area was hit, but Santa Rosa had the most damage, with over 5,000 structures gone. And one of the things that really struck me, normally we've been working the wildfires in California since 2015 in the Lake County area, and usually see in rural areas or mountainous areas the fires. But in Santa Rosa, it's a very concentrated urban area, which is pretty rare for me to experience, and it's very apocalyptic. So strange times we're in right now. This afternoon, I'm going to talk to you briefly about Puerto Rico. St. Vincent de Paul has 9 active conferences in Puerto Rico. Our conferences work under a council in the parish, and Puerto Rico has been a very intense situation for us. Unlike we are doing recovery work, we're working with Catholic Charities in Irma and in Harvey, but Puerto Rico has been extremely challenging because it was difficult for us to get supplies to the island. We had to air flight out the executive director of St. Vincent de Paul of Puerto Rico, who was dying, and we had to get a private plane in to take him out, and that was a very challenging event, both because we didn't have communications via text and phone lines were impossible, but we were able to get him out and get him to Miami, and he is recovering there. We've been in daily communication with our Vincentians, but it's not been an easy task for them. So some of the stats right now, the official, and I say official, the official death toll is at 54. There's a lot of controversy in Puerto Rico right now because there's some unofficial death tolls that have not been counted as disaster-related deaths, and many people are saying that the death toll will rise. There's also hundreds of people that have been unaccounted for at this time. And during disaster recovery, situation's always very fluid. Because sometimes people will have evacuated and not reported in, but I imagine that the death toll will rise in Puerto Rico. The economic toll is for the size of the island with the 3.4 million people is estimated to be at 95 billion. And you heard about the economic impact to the Houston area and to Texas. So you can imagine, and Puerto Rico was already having an economic crisis before Maria hit. The demographic toll is a bit similar to what we saw in Hurricane Katrina, where we have a lot of internally displaced Americans, and the island is losing population because people are evacuating to Florida and to other states. Florida is expecting up to 250,000, and so that's going to put a great strain on Florida and their resources. Currently, they've had over 35,000 families that have evacuated, and the total population is about 75,000. FEMA has processed and approved 224,000 applications, and that's pretty staggering, again, if you look at the total population of 3.4 million. If you look at a per capita basis, that's a lot of people that are applying for assistance. Electricity and water has not been restored at 100%. Every day I get texts. We use WhatsApp because that's one of the ways we can get communication with our Vincentians on the island. And every day I send them texts and asking what the situation is. And they're in the rural and the mountainous areas, it's still a very dire situation. The water's contaminated. They have to get water daily to the people. People lost their homes, and they fled with just the clothes on their backs. So our Vincentians have been providing basic necessities, kind of humanitarian assistance. And normally a month after an event, we don't see this type of assistance at this level. We're normally in the recovery mode, but we're certainly not in the recovery mode in Puerto Rico. So we provide a number of services during disasters. We do immediate humanitarian relief, and we worked with Catholic Charities in Houston. We had something called Parish Recovery Assistance Centers, and you'll see that listed on this list, where we took a key parish area and we served maybe 10 other parish areas and all the other individuals that resided in that community. We provide disaster case management, both privately funded and federally funded. Currently in Puerto Rico, we are doing some case management as we are doing in the other disasters throughout the United States. We provide information referral services. We do a program called House in a Box, where we give new furniture to families that have an unmet need, that aren't able to cover furniture that they've lost through either an SBA loan or through any other insurance that they may have. And then long term, we do something called economic recovery summits, because we realize we can do case management and we can help rebuild homes. But if businesses are lost, then it's going to be very difficult for people to go to work, and it's also going to decimate the local tax base. In Puerto Rico, we don't know what the long-term solution is going to be. So many of the small business owners, because there's no power, because there's no water, they couldn't stay in business. So they have left the island, and they've evacuated. Those people that could get out have left. And so it's a very difficult situation there. In California, in the wildfires, we had quite a bit of infrastructure damage done to businesses. For example, an entire Kmart was burned to the ground here, and a lot of small businesses. Yesterday, I was in Santa Rosa, and I was in a neighborhood, and I drove by, and there was a sign outside that said, "Please pray for me. I lost my home, and I lost my business." And so we feel like it's going to be critical in Puerto Rico and in other areas for us to work on these economic recovery summits, where we bring in individuals from higher education, from NGOs, from business, and from government to get together and think, how can we rebuild the infrastructure and the economic base in these communities? That's my contact information, and I'm trying to keep this brief because I know that we want to open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, at this point, we are opening it up for questions. I am hoping that you now have a clear picture of what the reality is for Catholic agencies and disaster relief, how climate change is already impacting, and can you start thinking about, since the science is telling us that climate change will have more of these kind of disasters happening? How are we going to respond? At the moment, I have a couple of questions. And the first one was for Alan about where people can get slides, and you had responded. Do you want to respond a little bit there about that website?
Well, about 7 years ago, I set up a website to address the climate change issue, and you will find there a lot of the talks that I've given in the last 5 years. Some are much longer than the 20 minutes I had here, which contain a lot of ideas. You'll also find the writings that I have. I write short articles for the newspapers here, and I've been doing that for 10 years, and each of them typically deals with one topic. So go to alanbetts.com is my advice. I can't answer all the things you'd like to know on air.
Right. This question's for Liz, and perhaps also for Natalie at some point. Liz, is there a role for community development financial institutions, such as community loan funds, at these economic recovery summits?
Yes, and we've had several of that type of institutions and organizations involved. We did a summit in West Virginia after the 1,000-year flood. We did one recently in Lincoln, Nebraska on the DeWitt floods, and we were doing the same type of summit for Irma, Harvey, Maria, and the wildfires.
Right. Natalie, I don't know if this is a question. Does Catholic Charities work with community development financial institutions?
Not at this point. I think that would be something that we would really love to do. We, very similar to Puerto Rico, have not really, we're still in the crisis relief mode, and we haven't been able to actually make it into full case management yet. So. Okay.
I think this question might be more for Alan, but Natalie and Liz can jump in. How can people use the information in this webinar to convince others that climate change is real and happening now?
That's a deep question. Depends where you live in the country.
Arizona. This person's from Arizona.
Okay. Well, here in Vermont, it's relatively easy. People want to know what they should do, and it's still very difficult to respond on the scale that we need to. I mean, the simple things that you can do individually, you know about. Energy efficient houses, energy efficient transportation. And I'll just flag for you there that the new plug-in hybrids, which represent no compromise as a car, things like the Prius Prime, are by far the most efficient way to drop your use of fuel by about 80%. And your energy use, well, you probably all know about making your houses more energy efficient generally. The people that you need to convince around you, you're going to have to do by example, and you're going to have to take this much, much more seriously and organize with those of your neighbors as a community to talk to everybody involved. There is so much false information being put around by political interests that I'm sure you're aware of, and by financial interests, because the fossil fuel assets are worth about $30 trillion. And in order to save the climate system for our children, we have to leave 2/3 of that in the ground. And the people that own it are not going to do that without a big fight. Politically, it's all about control and the fantasies that exist around free markets, which mean free markets to exploit, free markets, again, where we only do the things that are cost effective for the present bottom line, when the real issue is they're a disaster for our children and for the earth. And we are refusing to have that discussion in our society, with our friends, our communities, and in public. I would say get out there and do it.
Yes, thank you. This question's for, I think, Natalie and Liz. Do your agencies have volunteer sign-up websites where people that would be interested in volunteering for recovery efforts can sign up?
Yes, we do. You can go online and at catholiccharities.org, and we have a volunteer sign up, and you can say what you would like to sign up for. And if we are not, because we're collaborating to do some of the Muckingut and the hum rebuilds, but they're working with us. So we will assign you, if that's what you want to do, with the group that can help do that.
Okay,
Yes, and we have, you can go to sbdpdisaster.org. We do require criminal background checks on all of our volunteers, so be aware of that. And we do something called just-in-time training, depending upon the nature of the volunteer work. For example, right now we're not putting volunteers in Puerto Rico. We won't be doing that until December. I have an assessment team on the ground right now making sure that it's safe, and we don't send volunteers in areas where we're concerned about them being in harm's way.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll have to say we're the same. The other thing I would say is that people are getting sick from the mold exposure. So the people who are coming in from the outside to volunteer, they have had to go, several of them have had to end up going to urgent care, and they've been very ill, and it's because of the mold. There's so much mold everywhere.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question from Missouri. And I think, Alan, you responded with a little bit of it. You may want to elaborate a little bit. The top 3 things, in your opinion, that the average U.S. family can do to reduce their carbon footprint. I will put out one that is a little hard for many, but I think as Catholics, it may be easier if we go back to Meatless Friday as well as Meatless Monday, because lowering our consumption of meat is one way of dealing with this. Alan, you talked about cars. Do you want to elaborate some more?
All I can really say is that I have systematically gone through my life over the last 10 years. I have reduced my electrical consumption, and I've invested in a community solar array to provide the electricity I use. I've reduced my gasoline consumption by going to a more efficient car that I can plug in. I've gone through the house and retrofitted it so that it is much more energy efficient, which makes a big difference here in winter. But these are very broad issues, and there's lots of questions coming in asking for simple solutions to them. Essentially, people have to study and put the moral issue here as fundamental, because what we face for the future on our present path is a catastrophe for our children and grandchildren and for the earth. And we have to face up to that rather than simply avoid it. I can't tell you as individuals what to do. You can go out and look, and there's a wealth of information out there of advice, but you have to look at your lifestyle. You have to look at your consumption and look at what you spend energy and resources on, and look at all your waste streams and figure out how you can change and how you can help your churches, your community, and society change. It's a very big issue. I've said to 1 or 2 people, there's a lot on my website of ideas on this, but in your local communities scattered across the country, the issues are often different.
Yes, thank you, Alan. This question's from Dan in Maryland. I think it's going towards Natalie and Liz. And the question is, given and comparing the federal administration's religious freedom pronouncements with the disasters experienced, does the Catholic Church, do your Catholic agencies think the trade-off is worth it?
Could you ask that question again, please?
It basically is, given that religious freedom pronouncements that we have heard from our federal leadership, and comparing them to what's happening with the disasters, will that trade-off of what we're doing and religious freedom, does it have how do we deal with it? How do we?
I have not seen any impact. We're very fortunate because in the state of Texas, we have been able to set up certain things, guidelines with any of our state and federal funders that particularly allows us to not provide any services that are contrary to our beliefs, our religious beliefs. And so we are able to work with people. The other thing I think is really important, to me is that as Catholics, we do the work. We're service oriented, and we live our mission more than proselytize our mission. And so it's definitely in who we are to be there for people and be there for the most vulnerable. So what I've seen actually is that there's a very strong dependence from the city of Houston on Catholic Charities for assistance, and very high level quality of assistance because of our faith-based background and because of our deep respect for all human beings, regardless of ethnicity, gender, or religion.
Thank you. Natalie, that was Natalie. Liz, do you have any response?
Yeah, I would agree with Natalie. I mean, I think that we work with FEMA a lot. I was on a conference call this morning with FEMA on some rural communities in Texas and how we're going to do some community reintegration and community development. I think they respect who we are, what our values and morals are, and they know we witness by our presence. We don't proselytize. And so we've had a very effective relationship. If it's a situation where it would compromise who we are as Vincentians, then we certainly wouldn't take on the contract.
That would be the same with Catholic Charities in Houston. So we have gone back several times and said we would not take this contract because this goes against our beliefs. And they've, in every case, they've rewritten the contract to exclude that or have an alternative when it comes to those areas.
Thank you. We're getting a few questions that are getting into a little bit on the weeds on water quality and things like that I think I will have our presenter respond offline afterwards. But I do have a couple of questions here about youth and how to get youth involved, especially on advocacy issues. And I would say to any youth who's on the webinar that we welcome you on to be a supporter of Catholic Climate Covenant and take actions with us, get involved with us. Alan, do you have any other advice for youth?
Well, one of the very exciting things here in Vermont since the beginning of the year has been the acceleration of lots of youth-driven organizations which are coming together and cooperating with each other to address many of these issues and other eco-justice issues around the state. So I would say just go out and do it, and reach out to other communities if there's not much happening in your area, because this is an issue of justice through the generations. And what's happening here is that the youth are standing up and saying, what is happening in the climate system and in the energy system is not fair for us, for our future and our children's future. We have to do something about it, and they're not just taking no for an answer.
Thank you. Given the time and I'm trying to respect the hour, I'm going to end with also letting folks know that if they're interested in looking at ways for their parishes, schools, and Catholic facilities to reduce their carbon footprint, we invite them to look at this website called catholicenergies.org. It is our new program to lower carbon footprint from Catholic facilities. Just launched about a couple of weeks ago, so putting a plug for that. Thank you, all three of you, Alan, Natalie, and Liz, for joining us today. I think that this was a very successful webinar. I'm hoping folks now get a very, very good view of what Catholic agencies are doing to respond to what the scientists have been telling us for a while is coming and has already arrived. If you need more information, I have it up here on this slide. Please go to info@catholicclimatecovenant.org if you need to send us an email, or go to www.catholicclimatecovenant.org for our website. Thank you all. You should be receiving the webinar recording and slides in the next week. We will also be including it in the newsletter next week as well. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.